Ah, the American Pie franchise. 1999 was the rebirth and callback to a different era where actors in their teens, or perhaps early 20s, actually portrayed teens. It was a time of nudity and raunch and lots of Blink-182, harkening back to the old days of Porky's and Revenge of the Nerds. Or the like of any sex romp from the 80s. Hot Dog the movie, Hamburger the movie, or even Chili Fries the movie. Any assortment of fast food movies. Though the name, in and of itself, has become somewhat of a banner, and feels like the red-headed stepchild of, say, National Lampoons, producing all types of film excrement from its cinematic anus. But who are we kidding? All these went to DVD or whatever platform there was at the time. With Eugene Levy himself having been featured in all of these, he must have been getting blackmailed. The point is, only the original 4 American Pie films ever went to theaters. The first American Pie movie took America by storm and made short-lived celebrities out of the cast. So what happened down the road? After 2 stale sequels and a long hiatus, a 4th movie came out, American Reunion. And this one was all but forgotten and left for dead at the start. But do I have something to say about American Reunion? I don't really understand all the disinterest in this film. If you break down all of these movies in the franchise, this may actually be the most rounded, straightforward, and relevant to exist of the bunch. I'm Ben, editor of Cinema Gulp, and this is my case for American Reunion. So if we break down all these films, they kind of work like this in my mind. Pie was 1999, so its relevance existed as a teen summer raunchy sex romp, and on that level it worked. There's not really a story there other than a pact to all have sex, but it's filled with interesting and hilarious characters and exuded a retro's 80 high school sex comedy style. So for that, it worked and made a lot of money and stars out of most of its young cast. Thomas Ian Nicholas carried the bulk of the protagonist duties as Kevin. Jason Biggs was primarily the comic core. Chris Klein had the bigger love story, and Eddie K. Thomas was the most interesting by a mile. They all had their places, and it was well balanced and it worked. So the inevitable 2001 Pie sequel had absolutely no reason to exist. Money. The movie was terrible, and only a shade of the first one. After trying to rewatch this movie, I found myself less and less interested as each scene rolled by. Absolutely no story here this time around. None. And again, that would have been fine, but the big problem here is that the characters we met and loved in part 1 just didn't have anything to do this time around. The film had changed its assembled core and decided to really only focus on a couple of the characters, primarily the ones that really popped out of the scene in the first one. They shoehorned in an obligatory female love interest from the first one simply because some of them had turned into box office draws since then and could be featured on the poster for part 2, even if their roles are reduced to simply cameos. The story was literally only about Jim. Story. All other characters were completely sidelined. Then in 2003, the franchise really took a nosedive and got just cornier and cornier. American Wedding was even worse, whereas the last one at least tried fooling us that the film was about the old gang. Now even the trailers suggest that Jim's story was the main focus, and would be for the duration of this film. And again, that would be fine if it were funny. Gone was Oz and about a handful of the other secondary characters this time around. Possibly some of these actors left because they felt this material was beneath them, which would be admirable but false. Stifler was the worst in this movie, and I'm a big fan of Sean William Scott. I think he's got charisma and great comic timing. This time he's essentially a caricature of who his character once was, which was also a caricature of a stereotype. Sean William Scott was becoming quite the hot commodity at the time. I want to say even that year he had The Rundown with The Rock come out, so it sort of made sense to shoehorn him in some of his own subplot involving a love interest, blah 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 blah. But he's just so damn unlikable in this film, it's sickening. His character simply doesn't work as a focal point of a film. He only works for cheap gags and side jokes. Trying to make him more was just irritating. This time around, Thomas Ian Nicholas is almost without dialogue altogether, let alone no storyline of his own whatsoever, and Eddie K. Thomas is an afterthought, showing up only when Stifler's love story calls for it. Granted, they were all idiot, horny teenagers in the first one and even the second one. The third one, where you thought they might try to introduce some sort of maturity, they all come off like babbling buffoons, especially Stifler. I mean, for God's sake, his face is even second billing on the poster. He wouldn't be in that wedding party, would he? He wouldn't even be invited to that wedding. setting. Granted, this is all about a group of friends, but in a movie, you have a thing called a protagonist. And for the most part, that's what Kevin was in the first one. We followed his journey, where he had the most to gain and develop as a character.
No longer will our penises remain flaccid and unused.
Even in the second one, though he had much less screen time, the story was about letting go of the past, and that centered around his mindset. By the third one, he had literally nothing to say and was simply in the background for some of the ridiculous jokes. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out why they put Sean William Scott front and center in the third one. He was becoming the biggest breakout star out of all of them. Jason Biggs had a couple of mild hits after the first American Pie, but he just kept recycling sort of the same thing over and over again, where the other cast members really didn't do much. Total fail as both a sequel and a film. So then, granted it had been a while, but doesn't Reunion feel more like the ensemble feature that the first one was? To me, it completely does. Possibly even more so. This time, the filmmakers actually take their time to give us glimpses and updates on the lives of the characters. And I have to say, it's funny. It's a fucking funny movie. Again, there's no plot extending further than the fact that they're all back in their hometown for their high school reunion. And let's just void the fact that there mostly is no such thing as a 13-year high school reunion outside of this film. But it works, and it's kind of funny. I think the characters are updated, fleshed out, and some even given some redemption after what had happened or not happened to their characters in the previous two outings. Oz is back. You'll never be happier to see Chris Klein in your life. And he's actually given a storyline of what's happened to him and his career since part 2. And I'll admit, I think it's pretty fascinating and hilarious. I think it was a good route to take his character.
That's what dancing is, it's truth, and maybe...
Thomas Ian Nicholas even has a story this time involving his old high school flame from the first one and the feelings that come back when you see a person after a long time. He's married now, and so awkwardness ensues. Jim is once again sort of the main focus, but only has as much to do as he had in the first one. It just seems that Biggs has that charm and physical comedic timing that helps aid the really funny scenes. The one who may be left out the most is Eddie K. Thomas. His storyline could have been a little more interesting, though the idea of it was a good one for him. Then there's Stifler, which I believe they brought back down from Candyland and into the real world just a bit. He's got a decent amount of screen time here, but nowhere near that of American Wedding, and it works better for him this way. His scenes are effective and funnier for it. He's still the fifth wheel of the group of guys. That's where he belongs. All in all, call me crazy, but I feel strongly in saying that I like Reunion the best of the four. Usually that doesn't happen, especially those long-awaited hiatus films that come back and try to take a little bit extra cash out of a dead franchise. I think bringing them back for a reunion worked perfectly in this movie. The friendships, the bonds, and the relationships all seem to still be there and still feel effective, and there's still plenty of room for gross-out, raunchy sex humor. Such a good throwback to the first one. Feels like it could have been a direct sequel 13 years later without the other two thrown in there at all. The timing, the nostalgia, the more fleshed out characters, and the more realistic tone that found me engaged and related to what it is like to no longer be the kids with the future in front of them and always fighting the urge to look backwards. And it's really funny. So ladies and gentlemen of the jury, there was my case for American Reunion. I made the case, you decide. This is Ben for Cinema Gulp. We drink your cinema.
You're out of order! You're out of order!
Bed is on fire with passionate love. The neighbors complain about the noises above.